are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon. It's time to go ahead and get started again. I'm going to share out my screen, and you should be seeing the server administrator on the screen at this point. So if anyone cannot see that, please let me know. And otherwise, I think we are good to continue on. All right, so where we left off was finishing the web access configuration. We are going to continue on with login accounts right now. You may remember I mentioned before that the mFile server works similarly to SQL Server in the way that it handles login accounts and user accounts. So the login accounts are server-based and the user accounts are vault-based. On a SQL server, your login accounts are server-based. User accounts are database-based. So you can have, let's say, 10 login accounts on this server, and then they can be assigned to various vaults. So all 10 people do not have access to all of the vaults that you might have on this server. So you can assign certain login accounts as a user into a particular vault. That's why right here we see the login accounts, and you'll see it right down here as this node under the server. And then inside of each vault, you'll see a separate user section. So login accounts can be assigned as users into the vault. If we collapse all of this down, you'll see that the login accounts is directly under the server level and has nothing to do with the vaults themselves. It's at the user level within the vault that we assign them into that role. So let's take a look at the login accounts, and we'll see right here all of the login accounts that are assigned on this particular server. We can see the name of the account, how they are authenticated. We talked on the technical specs this morning that you could have a Windows login account or an mFiles login account. So this is just defining whether it's coming from the Windows domain or whether it is actually an mFiles user. And we talked about being able to mix and match these within the same server. Then we can tell whether the account is disabled, what license type it is. So you have named users, concurrent users, and read-only users. And then we've got the full name and the email. So if I just open one of these up, this is the account that I'm logged on with right now. You'll see my username, the domain I belong to, and that it has populated the full name and the email address. Now, because it's a Windows authenticated user, I can click this button right here, Update Information from Domain, and it will pull in the full name and email address from this user account in Active Directory. In this particular case, if I tell it to update, you'll see that my full name is here and my email has disappeared. That's only because on this particular server, this email account is not part of Active Directory. It is a completely separate email server, so it's not Exchange and Active Directory based, so it couldn't pull it from that account. Otherwise, you would normally see the full name and the email address both being populated or updated from the Active Directory domain. Underneath this, you'll be able to assign a license type for a user. So we could say no license so that we keep the user account in here, but just don't give them a license in case we want to come back and reassign licenses later. Otherwise, the named user license is going to be dedicated to this particular user. That means anytime they try to get in, they'll be able to get in because that license is dedicated to them. A concurrent user license is a license, it's part of a license pool. So that means that I can have certain people coming in and out of the system whenever they want to, as long as there's a license available. So imagine a pool of licenses. These licenses are in a bowl on a first-come, first-served basis. Let's say I have 10 licenses out there and 10 people grab a license and log in. That 11th person that tries to log in will not be able to, and they will have to wait until one of those other licenses is freed up. Once that license is free and essentially released back into that pool of licenses, another person would be able to come in. So typically you're going to want named user licenses for your internal users. Sometimes we'll do concurrent internally depending on how people expect the system to be used. And concurrent user licenses can work really well for external people. So imagine that you wanted to allow your vendors or customers or some type of external people like that to get access to a vault. They're not going to be logging in all the time. So maybe you have, let's say, 10 vendors and customers that could log in at any time, but maybe you only buy 5 concurrent licenses. Those 5 concurrent licenses then could serve all of those people, assuming that you're not going to have more than 5 logged in at any given time. A concurrent license is also good if you have people doing shift work, because you might have 3 different shifts running over 24 hours, but because none of those 3 people are there at the same time, they don't all need their own license. So you could do a concurrent license and have the morning, afternoon, and evening shift all share that license since they're not using it at the same time. And then finally there's a read-only license, which is generally exactly what it sounds like, is that you can get into the vault and read anything that you otherwise have access to. There are 2 exceptions to this though. A read-only license can complete assignments and they can push information through a workflow. So completing an assignment means that you might have let's say a supervisor makes an assignment to one of their employees that says, hey, you need to read this document. So if that employee has a read-only license, they're not only able to log into the vault and actually read the document, but they can then mark that assignment complete. Or you might have a situation where the person logs into the vault and something has been passed to them in a workflow. Maybe it is for the purpose of approving something in the workflow. If it's approving an invoice or a purchase order, something like that, they can view it, they can make the approval or reject it and push it through the workflow. So those are the 2 exceptions for a read-only user. Typically, you're going to think of it as just read-only, because you'll usually find that the people who are operating with workflows need more permissions than read-only anyway. However, if it's about completing assignments or something along those lines, that can be really useful for them to have access to complete those assignments even though they just have a read-only license. All right. Finally, we can disable this login account, which is what you see in this column. If it's disabled, it will show up that way. And then we can also designate a system administrator or designate this account as a system administrator. That means that they will have full control of this mFile server. So they can do anything within any vault by going to that vault and actually assigning rights to themselves, assigning rights to other people. So the system administrator is like a domain administrator in an Active Directory type situation. All right, so after explaining all of that, I want to run through very quickly and show how we could create a new login account. So let's assume that we're making a Windows login account, and the login account name is any.name. So you'll see down here, as it's a Windows authenticated account, I can put in the domain or computer name. So let's just type in new domain, and you'll see that it's building out my Windows account with that domain and username. If it really is part of this domain, I should be able to hit update information from domain and populate the full name or email address. I could also put that in on my own manually and then assign the license for this person. So let's say we want them to have a named user license. Maybe we want them to be a system administrator or not, and then we can click OK and create that particular account. So let's go find the account I created right here. I can open it up. I could then disable it if I wanted to, and ultimately I could delete it. So that shows you how you could create a manual or create a login account manually. Let me check the questions. There's some that have come in. All right. Previously I'd mentioned that the original login is the administrator. How do we maintain administrator and train and give the administrator to the client? So once you install this, so if you install the software on their server, in my situation being logged on as a demo user, I would be flagged as the system administrator. So then you would need to come in and create login accounts for the customer, and then you could designate one of those accounts as a system administrator. You can have more than one system administrator. It would just be the person who is the original system administrator that would come in and designate the others to begin with. So I think, so you said, can I have admin and give without taking client license, or do I have to get and share? So yeah, the administrator that's coming in here will actually be consuming a license. So in a situation like that, what you might want to do is, if you think that only one administrator might be in at one time, you could assign a concurrent license to all of the administrators, or assign name licenses to them individually, depending on how you need to divide that up. All right, so we looked at creating a login account manually. Let's look at importing login accounts. So this is where we see some more Active Directory integration, is the ability to pull these login accounts directly from the Windows domain. So if we select the domain in the drop-down list, I can choose the domain and then the organizational unit. Normally, and especially if you're in an environment that you're not familiar with, you're not going to know all of their organizational units, you might just choose any, and then under user group, I will also, in those situations, typically just go for domain users, which is going to show me all of those user accounts on the domain. I will usually sit with whoever can tell me who needs access to the system, and I can control click, shift click, whatever I need to do to select all of the user accounts out of here that I want to import, and then I will tell it what type of license I want. So I can either choose the specific type of license that would be assigned to all of those people, if I want them to all come in as named, concurrent, or read-only, or I might do no license if I want to come back and assign those licenses individually. I could also just say, all right, of these people I want to have named and click OK, and then come back into import again, choose a different set of people, and choose these to be concurrent, and so on, to get them all in there with exactly the license type that I need them to have. So doing this is going to add them as login accounts into the server. Any questions about this as far as getting the users imported? Okay, there's a question. Do I know if the Cloud Vault offering permits login import from the end client's Active Directory? It does allow that if you have a dedicated VPN connection from that cloud server to their location, to their network. So that's going to require a dedicated mFile server in the cloud, which is an additional charge, and then you will create a VPN, or we will do it on the cloud side, then someone would have to do it on the client side, is to establish that VPN connection between that cloud server and the customer's network. It's essentially going to join that cloud server to their domain so that then it can see everything within their network. You can then manage all of the login accounts as though it were local. You can manage hot folders as though they were local, database connections, etc. So you can do all of that if you have the dedicated server with the VPN connection. Okay, another question. Can the client do both NT and or cloud and SQL authentication? Do both NT and or cloud with SQL. Okay, so if you're asking just about the backend database, the SQL database it doesn't matter what you have on the SQL database if you're doing NT, SQL, or mixed. If you create a vault that is SQL based, it's actually going to create a user account that's specifically for that vault. So what happens is the user logs into mFiles, they authenticate to mFiles, and there's a new user account running in the background that's going to authenticate to the SQL server to pull the data on their behalf. So mFiles is still going to control visibility for that user. If the user has rights, there's essentially what's kind of like a proxy user on the SQL server that is exchanging that information. Let me know if that answers your question. I think that's what you were after. All right. Okay, the next thing that we want to look at is, as I said, we could disable one of these accounts, so we can just click any one of these and disable. We could then delete it, go into the properties and modify anything we want to. There is an option right here to show logged in users. This can be useful if you want to do any type of maintenance on the system, just to see who's in here at a particular time. You can also select a user and do a force logout. This is something you want to be careful of, but it does have its purpose. With a force logout, one time that you might really want to use something like this is with concurrent licenses, because with concurrent licenses you might have someone who leaves. Let's say they're out sick or they're on vacation and they stayed logged into the vault, which means they're consuming a license that someone else could otherwise use. You could come in here and force a logout, which would free up that license for someone else. The only danger in this is if they actually had something open at the time, they might lose those changes, and it really depends on which application that is. But you still may need to do that if you actually need to free up the license. All right. Kind of building on this idea of the login accounts, I want to go into the users area of a vault. So this is where we take the generic login accounts to the server and get much more specific at a user level. For example, we can come in here and specify that we want to add a new user to this vault. We're going to choose an existing login account to do that with. So if I wanted to add this MF Demo administrator account to this vault, I would select their login account, and I don't have to choose anything else at this point. I can just click OK, and now that person will have rights to log into this vault. I could also import individual users. Now this looks like the same thing that we did to just import login accounts, but if I do this, this is actually going to do two things for me. And so a lot of times we will go at it this way instead of importing the login accounts themselves. Is if I choose this, that I want to import users to this vault, I can still choose the license type and click OK. But once I do it, it's going to pop up a message box to me, and it's saying 0 new login accounts, but 3 new users were created. What that did is it added these 3 user accounts into my vault. It did not create login accounts because it didn't need to. All of these accounts already existed as login accounts. But what you can take away from this is that if, and I honestly don't know in this situation if there are any users in this domain that are not part of the login accounts, but let's try this one. Okay, that one is too. What would happen here is if they don't already have a login account, it will import their login account too and bring them in as a user. So you get both of those steps at the same time. There might be some reason that you want to just bring in the login accounts and not assign them to the vault at that time, which is why I showed you the login accounts to begin with. But as you're creating a vault, you might just want to add all of those users to the vault and have it bring in the login accounts at the same time. All right. Any other questions about the user accounts or login accounts? So one of the other questions that was up here said, so if they are application user or NT or SQL, they can authenticate. That kind of goes back to what I was saying before, that they're not going to be a SQL user. I was just comparing M files to SQL in the way that it is structured, but as far as working with M files, they will either have a Windows login account or a SQL shouldn't have said that. They will either have a Windows login account or an M files login account. If there is a SQL database for that particular vault, then that will be handled by M files, and they won't have to have a separate SQL account. Okay, another question. How can the admin assign a username and password for each user? Well, if they are Windows accounts, then they don't have to, because they will authenticate to the vault with their username and password through Windows. They're not going, it's a single sign-on. They will not have to log into the vault at all if they're using their Windows account. If they're using an mFiles account, if we go back to login accounts and create a new login account, I'll type new.user, and instead of Windows authentication, we will choose mFiles authentication. Now we can specify a password. So they're only going to have a password if they are authenticating with an mFiles account. With a Windows authentication, it's going to pass through their password from the domain. Other question, can we give user ability in mFiles to do this? You can, which is one of the next things that we need to look at the user level, is the various rights that can be defined. Now, these are, for the most part, administrator rights. So we're not talking about permissions to documents or other objects as it relates to the vault information. At this point, we're just talking administrator type rights to manage the environment. So the first thing you'll see is account is disabled. Remember, we can disable a login account. If a login account is disabled, then they are disabled across the entire server. But we can disable on a vault by vault basis. So let's say we had a single login account assigned to 5 vaults. I could come into 2 of those vaults and disable the user account. They would still be able to get into the other 3. Alright, the next one is if we don't want the user to create documents or other objects. That's not the same as read-only, because if they can't create, they could still edit or delete. But this is a special permission setting. Honestly, I'm not sure that I've ever seen this one used, but it's something that you could do if you wanted that assigned across the board. Again, with customers or vendors, if you have them logging into the vault, maybe you don't want them adding anything, but you are okay if they edit or delete it. This could also just be a really easy way. If you remember yesterday when we were looking at the object itself on the permissions tab, so if we look at the contact object on the permissions tab, there's this option that allows or does not allow that particular user or group to create objects of this type. So you could essentially assign this permission across the board by doing it at the user level, where that particular user cannot create documents or other objects anywhere, and then you just don't have to assign it on an object by object basis. Okay, the next one is user cannot create or modify traditional folders. This is definitely one that you want to check. If you're not aware of this, I'm going to show you, and then you can forget it, because remember, in mFiles we don't like to use folders. You may have seen in here, as an administrator anyway, that there is the ability to create a traditional folder. So if I come in here and create a folder, I'm going to call it folder 1, I can double click in here and create another folder, call it folder 2, and so on. I could create another one in here as well. If you look at my address bar, it looks very much like Windows Explorer. Even if I were to come up here and turn on the navigation pane and drill into this particular vault, you will see my folder structure right here. So I really am literally creating these static folders inside of mFiles. which is exactly why we want to turn that function off for users. You really shouldn't ever have users on a normal basis with a need to create their own folders in here. We want them saving with the metadata structure and being visible in the views. So why is this here? There are some special reasons. One can be for some backwards compatibility that we won't go into right now. It goes along more with the advanced course. If you are bringing documents in from an existing folder structure and linking those documents, and instead of importing them, and some people outside of M-Files still need to have access to them. That's one reason that you might do it, is you're having to maintain a folder structure in Explorer, so you want to maintain that structure in M-Files at the same time as you are trying to make that migration. Another reason might be that certain IT programs and software might require DLLs, settings files, and so on to be in particular directories in order to run. If you stored those in M-Files, you might need that true folder structure in order for it to function correctly. But normal users not dealing in situations like that, if they install software, that's not going to be an issue. If they are not an IT person, they're probably not going to run into those types of things. Personally, I do, and I might need to store things in a particular folder structure, but that's going to be more of an administrator type function. If that's your IT person needing to do that, they're probably somehow involved in the administration of the server anyway, which means as a full admin, they could do this whether they technically had the rights or not. But with normal users, you would want to make sure that this particular option is turned off. Finally, up here at the top, there's the external user option. This would be something that is really easy to throw someone into kind of a predefined group if they're not part of your internal employees or internal network. So I mentioned this yesterday, that we will see in certain areas the ability to assign permissions to internal and external users, or just the internal users. So this is making a distinction right here as to what type of user we're looking at. Are they, if they're not external, then they're presumed to be internal. Flagging them as an external user, you have a built-in group for that where you can easily kind of segregate or subdivide what they are seeing or not seeing, or what they do or don't have the ability to do. So you're kind of throwing them into a group right here just by checking that box. Alright, all of the rest of the options down here are administrative rights. So the question that came up earlier was about giving a user ability to manage these user accounts. You can do that right here without them having any other administrative rights. So they would not be able to destroy objects, delete objects, manage the metadata structure, or anything else. They could just manage user accounts. So the first option up here is full control of Vault. It's going to check this box. Everything else disappears because they've inherited all of that. They're going to be able to be a full administrator of this particular vault. I realize the person can have full control of one vault and no administrative rights in another vault because that's on a user-by-user basis. A system administrator could actually come in here and grant themselves these rights, though, because they actually have full and total control of the entire server. Okay, the next option is that they can see and read all objects, including deleted ones. So when you delete something in M-Files, it doesn't completely go away. It is just flagged for deletion. It's kind of like the recycle bin. If you delete something and it goes to the recycle bin, you can still go to that recycle bin and restore it or delete it from the recycle bin and then it's gone. So in this case, if we delete something, it's still in the vault. So a person with these rights could actually create a view to see those items that have been deleted. Once they can see them, we might want to give the ability to undelete those, which would be like restoring it from the recycle bin. We might also want to give them the right to destroy objects, which would be ultimately deleting it from the vault. We could also do a force undo checkout. Now, force undo checkout is kind of like a force logout that is very specific to a document or other object. So, like I said, if someone were out sick or on vacation and they had left a document checked out like this, we could right-click on that document and choose undo checkout for that particular one that the person has checked out. That's going to check the document back in, which means they will have lost their changes. So let's say they have a Word document checked out, they've been making edits, they didn't check it back in, then if we undo the checkout, it's as though that never happened. And so anything would be lost at that point. So it's something you want to be careful with to do, but could be a very necessary function under certain situations. So yeah, if you do that, there was a question about the history and what existed before. So if you did that, an undo checkout, it would be as though it were never checked out in the first place. So if it was at, let's say, version 5 and they check it out, so it's creating a version 6, if that document never gets checked in, you do the undo checkout, then that version 6 just goes away as though it never happened at all. All right, change permission for all objects. This means that you can go into the mFiles client and change any permissions that you want to, regardless of how those permissions are set. Obviously, this is a huge power function for an administrator, so you want to be careful as to who has that they could go and view anything even if they were explicitly not supposed to. All right, changing the metadata structure. This gives users the right to come in here and actually modify the vault metadata structure exactly like we were doing yesterday. So you can selectively allow this where let's say someone can change the metadata structure, but they don't have the rights to manage the accounts, or somebody has rights to manage the accounts, but not the metadata structure. And then finally, there's the option to manage common views and notification rules. There's going to be quite a bit covered at the beginning of the advanced course on creating views and how to create them, how to manage them, and so on, including the notification rules. But you probably know that users can create their own views. An administrator can create those views and make them common for other users. So it is this administrator right that allows that. So obviously, if someone has full control of the vault, they have exactly that and are able to do absolutely anything in here. Okay, are there any questions on any of these specific functions that we discussed? Anything that's not clear or wondering how something works? Yes, all of these settings should only be for a true administrator. Because of the way they're divided up, it is kind of nice that you could split up certain functionality. Let's say that maybe you do want a certain person to be able to undelete deleted objects, and so it doesn't have to be that one administrator, that you can selectively determine who can do certain things. Or maybe you want people to be able to push out views and notification rules to other people. So it's nice to be able to split these. You just want to be careful with exactly what the functions are and who you're giving this to. Okay, so we've covered users. Let's jump down to user groups. Right here, this is actually on the users section. We can import a user group. This importing a user group works just like importing a user, with one particular difference, and that is that once we select everything that we're looking at, we cannot selectively choose which users we want to import. We are importing the group and not users, so it's going to get everyone who's in that group. So you might have a group called mfiles users. Some people will do this where if they set up a new user in Active Directory, they will just assign them to the mfiles user group. And by doing that, and then syncing that group into mfiles from Active Directory, anyone who gets added to that group will automatically get an account in mfiles and could be assigned a particular license type that you designate right here. You can even then check this box to say check for new and deleted members every 15 minutes. That means if a new person is added to the group, they will be added into mfiles within 15 minutes. If they're deleted from that group, they would be pulled out. So that's a way to actually manage some of your licenses in mfiles just by doing it through Active Directory if you assign them to that proper group. And it doesn't just have to be that one group, like I said. It might be that you have an HR group and an accounting group and a legal group and so on, and you sync all of those. So whenever the person gets added to the proper group that's getting synced in, that account will automatically, that login account will automatically be added into mfiles and into the proper vault group. All right. I was looking at one of the questions. I'm not totally clear on that. So I guess we need an import-only user account. Oh, if they're just going to be importing documents, an import versus an admin. Let's see, if they were just going to be importing documents, then they would need the ability to create documents, but based on their permissions, you might have revoked the ability to edit or delete those documents, which is not really going to be at the user level at that point, because here at the user level, let's say we don't grant any type of administrative rights. This would just be a normal user. From here, then, we would control permissions as to what they can do in the vault from a user standpoint. Like, can they create documents, read only, edit, delete, change permissions, and so on. So we can then grant those types of rights for the user throughout the vault. That's going to be something that's covered in the advanced course, is exactly how all of those permissions are set up. Right here we're just defining the user for the vault and controlling what they can do at the vault level. As to what they can do with the data, the documents, etc., that's going to be controlled with the permissions within the vault, which is what we actually hit on in the advanced course. Alright, so with user groups, as we were just talking about, we can import those user groups. This is the exact same thing we just saw from the users area, just a couple of different ways to get to it. So we can import the user group. We can also create a new user group. So I could create, let's say, an HR staff group. Maybe I want to create an HR admins group, and then maybe I just want an HR group. So my HR group could contain staff and admin. So for staff, I might want to add in a couple of users. For admins, I might want to add in a couple of different users, but then both of these groups together comprise the entire HR department, and so I could get HR staff and HR admins as part of the overall HR group. This can be mixed and matched with Active Directory as well, so that you could bring in let's say you had an Active Directory group called HR staff and you had an Active Directory group called HR admins. You could bring both of those in. If in M files you want to be able to refer to them as one, then you just create that HR group and add the HR staff and HR admins group into the HR group, even though they came from Active Directory, because you would have it imported into here already. So you can mix and match any of those groups just to help you control your group membership. Where we are stopping with this discussion right here is to carry this forward into permissions. Obviously, we've talked around that as far as getting login accounts in here, getting the login accounts in as users to the vault, and then looking at certain administrative rights that we could give a user as far as maintaining the vault itself. We've now looked at how to put those users into groups, whether the groups are coming from Active Directory, created in M files, or some mixture of that. Now that we have those groups, it's going to be really easy to carry that forward and start assigning permissions for them. But that's going to be the topic for the next class. What I do want to bring up right now, and it should be stressed in the next class, is that you always want to keep your membership in here, or your I do want to say this about permissions right now, is that they should all be role-based. You want to be very careful and not assign permissions to an individual, and instead assign permissions to a group, because if you assign the permissions to the individual, it's going to be extremely difficult to go back through the vault and find every place that you assign permissions to that particular individual. Presumably you're assigning permissions to that individual because of what their job function is, what their role is. And so what happens if you decide to hire someone else into that same position? That new person needs to be able to get access to or have rights to the same things that the existing person does. You don't want to have to go through the whole vault and find all of those rights so that you can assign it to the second person. It would be much better to just have to assign, if you would assign the rights to the group instead of the individual, then you could put other people into that group and they will inherit those same rights. So if you assign all of your rights to groups, you could come in and add a person to a group and they will immediately take on all of the permissions that you want. Literally less than a 1-minute change. The same thing could happen if you have people in an organization changing positions. Someone quits or gets fired and someone new is hired in, or the person moves from one department to another. That means when they go from one department to another, they probably need to get certain rights that they didn't have. They might also need to be giving up certain rights that they did have. Well, again, rather than having to go through and find every place that that user exists in the vault and take rights away and add rights in, all you have to do is remove them from the group that they don't need rights for and add them to the group that they do. As long as those rights are assigned to the group properly, then they will inherit all of those permissions that they should get. So that's all I'm going to say on the permissions aspect, but it does relate very much to the concept of creating these groups, is to make sure that you're creating groups around the role of the employees. And that even goes for something like this. Let's say that I have this person as an HR admin. Even though it's one person, create a group of one. Again, because now I can assign rights to HR admins all day long. Now, what if this person is no longer an HR admin? All I have to do is pull them out, put somebody else in here, and I have now taken all of those rights away from the first person and granted all of those rights to the second person just by changing the group membership, even though it's only one person. So just make sure that you're defining it that way, because you're going to save yourself huge headaches down the line as you're trying to manage all of these permissions going forward. All right, any questions, any other questions at this point about groups, importing groups, assigning users, any of those other topics? Okay, the next thing that we want to look at, we talked about the metadata structure hierarchical view yesterday. There are definitely things about the objects and the way the objects can work together that we did not cover. It was not intended to be all-inclusive, but there will be additional topics covered in the advanced class related to that, such as the other automatic naming conventions, connecting to external databases, and so on. Just other topics that we either don't have time for or that truly are more advanced topics that will need to wait beyond this. What I do want to look at, though, is in the metadata structure flat view. We talked about objects, classes, and properties, and we touched on value lists, but I want to talk about value lists a little bit more. Yesterday we were talking about when you should create one class and then create a second class, or whether it should stay one class and just add a property that's a drop-down so that you can distinguish between types of information that are all in the same class. Another topic I want to cover right here is how do you know whether to create a value list or an object? It's a question that comes up quite a bit. The thing about a value list, and I touched on this yesterday, is that if we look at the contents of the value list, those values, CANYTX, those are the only values that exist. It has an ID that you see over here to the right, and it has a value. This is equivalent to the name or title property. So that's just like the name or title property, and then everything has an object ID assigned to it. So How would you know whether or not to create this as a value list or an object? Well, the first thing you always want to ask is, am I maintaining more than one piece of information? Let's see. Some people are saying that the audio is going away. Has the audio come back at this point? Let me know. Okay, the audio has come back. All right. Well, I apologize for that. I'm looking to see if there's any type of issue going on here. It looks like everything's working okay. Okay, well, I will back up for just a second. It looks like it was not gone for very long. So what I was talking about is how to know when you should create a value list and how to know when you should create an object. The really easy decision here is whether or not you're maintaining a single piece of information or multiple pieces of information. In this particular case with our state list, we know that we are only maintaining a single piece of information, and that is the state abbreviation. That makes it a perfect candidate for a value list. If I had said I want to maintain the two-letter abbreviation as well as the full spelling of the state, it cannot be a value list because a value list can only have a single value in it. So if I wanted a property for the abbreviation being TX and I wanted a property for the full spelling of the state name, I would have to make it an object. So that's the first way that you can decide which you want. A department list is an example right there. Is let's say that I had a list of departments, administration, human resources, IT, etc. If I only need a list of departments, it's a good candidate for a value list. If I need to maintain a location for that department, let's say a mail stop location or a building location, I need to know who the supervisor of that department is. That's adding information to it. Now I'm going to need to put those departments into an object type instead of a value list. So really quick to make that decision. Some other things to consider here, though, about value lists versus objects is number one, whether or not it needs to be maintained very much. Value lists are going to have to be maintained in whole by the administrator. So we can come into the contents here and you see we can add, edit, or delete any of these items. In the client side, a person can only have rights to add items. You can actually make it so they can't add them at all, but that's the only right that they can have in the client side is to add. They will not be able to edit values in a value list. They will not be able to delete values in a value list. So again, even if it's a single data value like these state abbreviations, I mean, let's say that our state abbreviations were changing all the time for some reason, you would not want to have that in a value list because no one would be able to maintain it. So that is when you're going to want to create an object. So you need to think about whether or not someone needs to maintain this information or whether it's going to be more static. If it's one-dimensional static information, it's great for a value list. If it's not one-dimensional or if it's not going to be very static and will have to change and be edited a lot, then you'd want to put it in as an object type. If you start it as one type and you decide later that you need to add information or that it really does need to be edited more than you thought, you can always select the value list right here and choose Convert to Object Type. So this is, once you go to an object type, you can't bring it back to a value list, but more than likely you wouldn't need to because at that point you're probably adding some more information or making some type of change. But if I select this value list and say convert to object type, it's just letting me know that that's what I'm doing. I can't undo it. Am I sure that I want to convert it? And I say yes. What happens is it disappears as a value list, but if I expand my metadata structure, I now see it as an object in my hierarchical view with a class of the same name, exactly the way every other object was. And inside that class, you see the name or title property. That took the name information from the value list and put it into a name or title property in the object. So any data that I had on that value list is now going to be on the object. So I didn't lose anything, it just converted it and shifted the data over for me. So there's a question on repercussions on changes if values or properties are changed. So if you do change the information, it will have a ripple effect, meaning if, let's say, the Texas abbreviation had changed from TX to TS, then if I come in here and change it, every place that it had been referenced in the vault will change to TS. It's typically a good thing, just something to be aware of. Same thing, I mentioned yesterday about like on a contact or an employee, we have first name, last name, and full name. The full name is going to recalculate if you change either the first name or the last name. Well, since the full name is the concatenation of that information, let's say a woman gets married and changes her last name, we now want to change the last name on her employee record, which will also change the full name, but we want that new full name to be reflected throughout the vault. So it's an effect of making that change, but yes, you do need to be aware that it is going to do that cascade update throughout the database. So next question, so would we want to or not want to associate a contact with a customer and or vendor as those properties are the same values? Not sure what you're asking there. I mean, you would associate a contact with a customer or a contact with a vendor, however you're doing that. If any of the information changed in one place, it would just be reflected in the other place. So if the contact name changed, then when you're looking at the vendor or the customer, you would see that new contact name reflected. All right, any other questions about value lists or objects? Just wanted to make that distinction while we were here in this metadata view. I'll also point out this is true for objects, value lists, property definitions, and classes. There are options right here to show all. There are hidden objects, hidden value lists, hidden property definitions, and hidden classes that you might want to be able to see at some time. That's not something that as a beginner with the vault that you will necessarily need access to, but if you look at the property IDs, any ID that is under 1,000 is a, well, actually even some of those too, but definitely those under 1,000 are built-in property values. Actually, it looks like we start at right around here, probably 1018. Looks like the first one that is a custom created property. But there are some built-in objects, built-in value lists. On the value list side, you'll see a value list of users, for example. Value list, that's what allows you to choose from a list of users just like we did when we created our employee and chose the mFiles user. It was coming from a built-in value list. Our workflow states, the class names, etc., all of that can be visible in a value list. So just pointing that out, we're not going to do anything with it right now, but it's good to know that there are some hidden values or built-in values that you might want to be aware of. Okay, workflows, named access control lists, connections to external sources. Those are 3 sessions out of the 4 sessions right there in the advanced course. They are all very in-depth, detailed topics that you'll spend a lot of time there on the advanced course. So we're going to move right past that right now and start looking at the event log. So there's another question. Hold on one second. So as you mentioned, we can do a multi-select, so we could use that function and utilize permission. Employees already created can become project manager. So yesterday I created a new property called project manager and chose from a list of employees, but my employee then has an mFiles user property in here that is a choose from list of users. So now I have my mFiles user property here that's choose from list of users. That links the login account to, or I should say the user in this vault, links that user in the vault to the employee, and then the project manager is a list of employees, so that's what linked it to the user as well. So it's all cascading and relational through there. Alright, looks like there was another sound problem. Okay. Alright, so we want to skip on down to the event log. Now, the event log in a vault is showing you everything that happens in the vault with the objects in the vault. So this is all about saving, opening, closing, editing, making any types of changes, and so on to the information in the vault. It does not have anything to do with the mFiles application itself, so I need to make this distinction. If you're coming along looking for who did what to what, who added, edited, deleted, checked in, checked out, made some type of change to the vault, who did it, what did they do it to, what time did they do it, those types of things, you're going to find that in the event log. What you will not find in the event log is error messages. So if you're looking for why did this email notification not get sent? Why did this scan not get imported? Did a particular job complete, for example? Those are all at the application level for the server, and they are stored in the Windows event viewer, not in the event log for the vault itself. So what we have to do to see that is I'm going to log back into the server really quickly so you can see what kinds of messages we might see on the server related to mFiles. So wherever your mFiles server is installed is where you're going to want to go to find out what's going on with your application. So if we go to Administrative Tools, Event Viewer on the mFile server, when we look at the application Windows log, here you will find events related to mFiles. So here's the source of mFiles. We have an error. It cannot find a particular folder right here. This one looks like the same thing. This is a new demo image, and I know that this folder has been deleted, so it's still looking for that deleted folder. So anyway, there's some situations right there. I have had it happen where I have set up a notification rule where I want the email to go out. I never receive the email. That's a situation where I would want to go to the Windows Event Viewer and see what's happening at the application level. That's not a user taking some action in the vault. That would be the application itself supposed to perform some function and it didn't happen. So if the notification doesn't go out, it could be because I don't have an email address on that login account. So when we're creating the login accounts, it's really important whether you get it from Active Directory or you specify it yourself that the email address is put in at the user level, because when users are getting notified of things, it's using that email address. You want to make sure that that's filled in. But it might not have sent the email because, let's say right up here when I put in the notification settings, maybe I put in the wrong server name, or maybe I was supposed to use SMTP authentication and I didn't, or I did use it and I put in a wrong account name or password. All of those could be reasons why the notifications are not working, and you would just need to verify that information after finding it in the event log or in the event viewer, and it's going to tell you, hey, it didn't send it because it couldn't authenticate to the server, or it couldn't find the server, or there was no email address specified, any of those particular reasons. In this case, what we're seeing, like I said, it's trying to process this particular folder, and it tells me right here the system cannot find the path specified. So it's trying to monitor a folder that doesn't even exist anymore. So those are the types of issues that you can find in the event viewer that will be really helpful. Otherwise, the event log is keeping this true audit trail of what's going on inside the vault. So we can see right here, we created the vault yesterday, we've logged in, we created a user. Here's other user groups created, user groups modified. This is all of what we've been doing today. We have not created any documents or stored any documents. We haven't created any objects in here. We just created the metadata structure yesterday, and now we've added users and groups to this particular vault. Okay, any questions about the event log or the event viewer? How they differ, what you might be looking for? All right, so these next two I want to mention so that you're aware of them. These are actually not even covered in the advanced course, partly for time and, well, really for time. It's something that could be in kind of a second advanced course. One of them is the reporting module, and I mentioned that earlier when we were talking about SQL Express. So you all need to know, I have pointed this out to a lot of people that were not always aware of it, is that within, I'm going to turn this navigation pane back off. is that within a vault, within a view, such as Manage Customers, you notice here that we can come in here and insert any property column that we want to. We can drag and drop those property columns however we need to in any particular order. So, wanted to point that out first, is that you can customize what a particular view looks like in any way that you want to. Once you have that, you can right-click in that view and choose Export, and choose Export Visible Columns Only. That is going to export a CSV file with exactly the information that you're showing here. So I'm just going to label this Customers, click Save to my desktop, and if I go look at my desktop now, I should have, let's find it right here, a CSV file that I can open in Excel, and I have a nice export of information. I can bold it, underline it, make any other types of modifications I want, say, okay, this one I don't even have information for, so I'm going to delete it. I can pretty quickly get some kind of custom report out of M files just by exporting the metadata. What I can't do in here, though, is I can't count the customers. I can't tell you, even if I had, let's say, the date that we started business with this customer, I can't tell you how many customers did I acquire within a particular month, within a particular year. I can't tell you how long I've had the customer, and so on. All I'm doing is a strict export of the data. Those would be good examples of where you might want the reporting module. You can use the reporting module to chart, to graph, to calculate, to display information that is analyzed or manipulated in some way other than just spitting it out. So if I take that information and put it into the reporting module, I now have a good way of producing that information in a useful way for the users. So there's a question about those modules being optional. So the reporting module is an additional module for a fee, which is part of the license code. So if we go back to the server level and look at license management, you'll see that we have purchased OCR, e-signing and compliance, and reporting. OCR and e-signing and compliance will be covered in the advanced course. Reporting is pretty much a course all by itself. It can be so extensive as to how it all works that it's something that would have to be offered by itself. I can also direct you to the website, though. There is a getting started guide with the reporting module that's about, I think it's about 50 plus pages that actually walks you through an entire configuration and setup of the reporting functionality, and about 4 or 5 examples that it walks you through creating those reports with a sample vault. So it's really helpful if that's something that you're interested in. Essentially, like we talked about this morning, what you would have to do for reporting is have SQL reporting services, and that can be either from a full version of SQL Server like Standard or Enterprise, or you could also use SQL Express for that reporting database, even while your vault resides in Firebird. So the reporting module is extra. Now this content replication and archiving is not. This is a base functionality. It's part of the core product and does not require a license. So the replication and archiving, we've also touched on this a little bit. We were talking about business continuity, disaster recovery, high availability, is if you were to have a server either on-premise or in another location that you were replicating to, this is what you would use. So you could actually choose to schedule the export of content from this particular server based on all kinds of search criteria. You can determine exactly what you want to go out, exactly when you want it to go, exactly where you want it to go, and it's going to go into a folder that sits out somewhere waiting for the other vault to get it. So we can export content and we can import content. So an export on this side would send that information out to a package that we could then import on the other side. And that's exactly how replication is working, is the vaults do not have to be in direct contact with each other. They have to be in direct contact at some point with a common location between them. Meaning that if I have an on-premise server and an off-premise server, I just have to send this export package out to a location that my other server can access and bring it in. And these can happen at different times. So I might send information out at noon and the other one doesn't pick it up until 3 o'clock. And of course, normally you wouldn't want to do that. You want to keep it as live as possible. But the benefit there is if a server goes down, if an internet connection goes down, if power goes out, it's not going to stop the other server from doing what it's supposed to because they don't have to be in direct communication with each other. So you can replicate at any interval that you want to. And again, this is a built-in functionality. So you can do this right out of the box. One of the things that to point out here that's new in version 10 is not only to replicate the vault information, but now we can actually replicate the vault structure. Now this is huge because this means that we can take bits and pieces of one vault and move it into another vault or copy it into that other vault. So one way that you might use this is if we were creating, or a really good way to use it is like a sandbox and production environment. So you might have one vault that's a sandbox test environment that you are making modifications to. And as you make those modifications and add new objects and code and functionality and get everything tested, you could now come in here and choose exactly which objects you want to push. So I could push just my new employee object and my workflows or a particular view that I have created and push all of that new functionality into my other vault. I don't have to recreate it in the new vault. I don't have to put it in there and test it again because my sandbox environment should be exactly the same as my other vault, but just with that new functionality that I can now push in. Better yet, as part of this, you could have your sandbox vault and your production vault do basically a one-way replication so that everything that's happening in your production vault is constantly replicating into your sandbox vault so that as you are doing testing and development on the sandbox vault, you also know that you're doing it with current data. I won't say live data, but you're doing it with current data because if things are constantly replicating into the sandbox, you basically have a data copy of your production environment in your test environment. This is going to give you really nice ways to do some additional development and push it back to your production environment. But we could also do this replication in a high availability type situation or business continuity if you needed to push any objects that way as well. So there's a question about the version being the same. So yes, you definitely want the version to be the same. So you would have mfiles 10 dot whatever version on each server. And so the vaults would start out being the same, or well, maybe they don't, but you would think that you've got a vault going into production make a copy of it and hold it back in a sandbox type environment, and then you can continue development in the sandbox environment. Let your production vault continue replicating data back to your sandbox environment so that you see current information, and then replicate your objects from your sandbox environment into production when you're finished. This is also a really good way if you're doing development for different customers. If you create something really nice and cool for one customer, is to be able to strip that out of that vault and make it available or sell it to another customer. But you could easily start taking components of different vaults, putting them together with other components of other vaults, and create some really nice custom solutions. All right, we have a couple of other topics that we need to cover here. One of those is at the vault level, and the other one is about scheduled jobs and backups. So let's talk about the vault first. Yesterday I created a new document vault, and I did it very quickly, saying I was just going to accept the defaults. So let's start talking about what defaults I accepted and what changes I could have made. So first of all, I named my vault. No big deal. We'll call it new vault. I can choose a primary language here, which any one of these can be chosen as the primary language, and then depending on the primary language you choose, you will have certain options for a secondary language. So this is for the full text search aspect, is that it will read it and use that as search terms, assuming that the search term you're putting in is in a certain language. Then I can put in a vault icon. This is also new in mFiles 10. In mFiles 9, when we looked at the M drive, they all had the same M icons. Now you see various icons for the different vaults. So in an environment where you have multiple vaults, maybe even in one where you don't have multiple vaults, it might be nice to see a custom icon here. And so you can, when you do import for the icon, you can choose from the same icons that we have for everything else. You can also browse for and bring in your own custom icon if you want to. So the language, there's a question about the full text search. The language is based on mFiles, I believe. I don't think that's coming from the database, but I believe that is based on mFiles. Okay. Then we could turn over to the Advanced tab, and you'll see that by default on the Advanced tab it says that it's going to use the Firebird database. So the built-in embedded Firebird database is always what's going to be used if you don't choose otherwise. When we choose the Firebird database, we can go into Define and choose some additional options, one of which is where we want this vault data to be located. So by default, it's going to go into the program files directory where mFiles was installed, into a server vaults folder, and then it will get its own folder name inside of there. We can change that and make that go anywhere we want to. You'll see down here the metadata and the files are going into subfolders within this area. So I could change this to anything that I want to. This message that pops up is if you are doing administration on a remote computer. So if I'm connecting into my server from a remote computer, I cannot browse that server for security reasons. So I either need to get on the server itself, which I could remote into it or get directly on the console, or I just need to type in the path here instead of being able to browse for it. So you'll see that in several situations. If you try to browse, it won't let you browse the server for security reasons if you're on a remote machine. Now I can also click into the Advanced button and choose a separate location for the file data. So notice that right now the files are going to go into that same subfolder area, but I could choose a separate location for the file data. Let's just do C/file data, and we'll see that the metadata database is going in one place, the files are going to another. I could also set an account for the file data so that instead of using the local system account, I specify a particular account, local or domain account, to access that particular folder. This might be a good thing from a security standpoint. As I said, there's going to be some administrator who can get to this information, but the more you lock it down, the better. You could lock the database down, lock the file data down, control who your administrators are, and you're not going to have much chance of a breach of any of this information. So we could choose a different location for that file data if we want to, or have it go to the same place. So this is where ultimately you could have M files on one server, your database on another server, particularly when we look at SQL here in a minute, your files on a third server, and then you could actually run IIS as the web server for web access on a fourth server. So you could distribute this across as many as 4 machines in a typical environment. So if we choose OK to this, that's actually all we need to do from the database standpoint. We do have the ability to turn on the e-signing and compliance for audit trail features on a vault-by-vault basis. Remember, e-signing and compliance does require a different license code, which is activated at the server level, but we can then choose whether to use that functionality on a vault-by-vault basis. The real reason for this is because in a normal DMS vault, the audit trail will only become, I believe it's 10,000 entries long, and depending on how many objects you have and how many people you have accessing them, that event log can fill up and then will start overwriting itself. If you use e-signing and compliance, because of the compliance aspect of that, it will not overwrite the event log and will just keep adding on to it, which means you will need to come in and maintain that event log at some point. But because of compliance reasons, you don't want to just start overwriting audit logs. It depends on how you're using that audit log as to whether or not you really want to turn this on. If you're using it for your own purposes internally, just to monitor certain functionality, then you can probably leave this off. If you really want the detailed information and that it does not ever overwrite itself, then you can go ahead and turn it on. It's just something that you need to be aware of, that the audit log will continue growing over time. Okay, there's a question, says, so are you saying an accounting login could still be used or not? I think if you're talking about this, where we were talking about an account for the file data, that is just a user account that could access that particular folder structure. Doesn't have anything to do with who can log into the vault. This is just who's able to access the folder structure on the file server. Hope that answered that question. This particular box right down here at the bottom, extended metadata driven permissions, will always be on by default, and it should be on, it should be left on for any new vaults that you create. That is here for some backwards compatibility, because prior to version 8, there were different permission structures, and it was with version 8 that we introduced the metadata-driven permissions that you'll learn about in the advanced course. And with the metadata-driven permissions, you need to, there was some older code that might not work with that. So it was an option to turn that on or not when you were bringing a vault, upgrading a vault from an older version to a newer one. But at this point, for new vaults, you would always want that on to get the full features and functionality out of the software. Okay, instead of Firebird then, of course you know that we can also use Microsoft SQL Server. So in here we have to define how it's going to connect to the SQL Server. So we have to provide the server name that we're connecting to. We can tell it what we want the name of the database to be. In this case, I'm going to make it the same as the vault name. And then we can choose how we're going to authenticate to that SQL Server. What we need right here is a system administrator for the SQL Server. This is not the same account that is going to access the information. We just have to provide this so that a new database can be created on the server. So if I used let's do the SQL Server authentication, and we use the SA username and password, I can test the connection. Test connection succeeded, so it's found the server correctly. We can now specify the file data location, just like we did for Firebird, but we can store that in the Vault database or store it in a file system folder. Now, I mentioned earlier today I would not choose that option of storing in the Vault database. Make sure that they're in the file system, and then when you click Define, you have the same option that you did with Firebird, is choosing where they go, and if you want to set a specific account for accessing that folder structure. Once you finish that, you can click OK, and it's going to create the database on that server and then finish out creating the vault for you with that particular database. So that runs through all the options that you have when you're creating a vault. I did it so quickly yesterday because I just named it and moved forward. If you wanted to change the icon, change the type of database, or even in keeping the Firebird database, if you wanted to choose different locations, then you would need to come in here and specify that, and whether or not you want to turn on the audit trail or not. All right, any questions, any other questions about creating a vault at this point? All right, inside the right-click menu for a vault, we have operations. We can back up the vault, copy the vault, migrate to SQL Server. Migrating to SQL Server is just as easy as it is to create the vault with SQL Server in the first place. You're just going to specify the server name, the database name, how you're authenticating to SQL Server with the same system admin permissions so that it can create the new database, specify the file location just like you would with a new database, and click OK, or with a new vault and click OK. It will then migrate from Firebird to SQL Server. The timing of that is totally going to be dependent on how big the vault is. I've done it for, let's say, the sample vault, which you know is actually small, but it will do it in probably a couple of minutes. Doesn't take long, but clearly going from Firebird to SQL on a very full-size vault could take quite a bit of time. So just make sure you allow for that if you're making an upgrade of that type. So we can detach the vault, which would take it out of the administrator, but it will leave that entire folder structure out there, meaning if it's a Firebird database with the files out there, it will leave the database and files intact. It's just removing it from the administrator. If it's a SQL vault, it will leave the files intact, leave the database on the SQL server, but still just remove it from this particular server. That might be something you'd want to do if you don't want to maintain it from this server anymore or from this administrator. You can get rid of it from this administrator and then attach it into a new administrator, which has nothing to do with where the server install is located or whether you're moving it. You can leave it exactly where it is and just detach it. And then up here you have the ability to attach a vault. You just point to exactly where it needs to find either the Firebird or SQL vault that you're going to connect to. And then it will attach it in here. So if we were to detach this basic training vault, I could then come back and reattach it and bring it back in here. We can destroy a vault. Just be careful with that one. Destroying does exactly that. It's going to remove it from here and it will destroy the folder structure, the database, and everything. So it's a one-shot deal that after a confirmation, it will take that vault right out of there. All right, under maintenance, it's going to optimize the database thoroughly once a week, which is under scheduled jobs that we're about to look at. You can do a rebuild of a full text search. You can do verifies and repairs on the database. Typically, you're not going to need to do that, but you might need to at some point if you end up with any kind of corruption or performance issues. Those are really rare. I have run that on a vault on occasion and had it correct an issue. Usually it was when I was doing a lot of development and destroying and recreating and moving things around a lot that it just needed to rebuild its internal information to kind of know what was going on and where it was going on. All right, so I want to take a look really quickly at scheduled jobs. I just talked about the optimized database. Every time you create a new vault in M-Files, it's going to create this job for you automatically. It's the optimized database thorough job. So right here we've got the one for basic training that we created yesterday. If we open that up, we could give it a description other than this. You'll see the description column is blank. And we could change the schedule. By default, it's running at midnight every Sunday, starting with the Sunday following when you create it. But you can come in here and modify that schedule and make it as often as you want to. Typically, running this once a week is going to be just fine. The other thing that you're going to want to do is create backup jobs. So I click on a new scheduled backup job, and let's say that I want to do a full backup of basic training. So this is the vault that we created. I want to do a full backup, and I'm going to back up. You'll choose the vault you want to back up and whether you want to do full or differential. You will then tell it where to put that backup file on the server. This is one of the situations where I can't browse because it's a remote server, but I can type it in. So I'm going to type in C backups, and I can tell it to overwrite existing files or not. If I wanted to come in and create an incremental backup, I could create a new job called incremental backup. I'm sorry, differential. I didn't. mean that differential backup of basic training, and come in here when you choose the vault, just choose differential backup instead of the full backup, and you could still overwrite existing files. This is very mechanical here as to what we're doing, so I want to give a little bit of description on what you should be doing here as far as backups are concerned. First of all, obviously, you're going to want a full backup at a decent interval. So if we choose full backup right here, let me come back and rename this to full backup. In my backup folder, one thing that I might do is, let's just say full backup, and it's going to make it a .mfb file. If I tell it to overwrite existing files, then every time it runs this full backup, it's going to overwrite this. And if I schedule it for every Monday, that means every Monday when this job runs, it will overwrite the full backup from last Monday. That is a pretty good start to a backup strategy. The next thing that you would want to do is to come in and do a differential backup, like we were just talking about. But when you do the differential backup, you would want that to run on days other than when you're doing a full backup. So let's look at doing a differential backup on Tuesday. And so we'll come to the vault, choose basic training, do a differential backup. We're going to put it in that same folder called backups. And this one I'm going to label, instead of just like I did full backup, I'm going to do Tuesday differential.mfb. We'll tell it to overwrite existing files and click OK. Now what I've got right here is a full backup that's running every Monday and a differential that's running every Tuesday. The idea here would be to create another differential for that vault that's going to run on Wednesday and overwrite existing files. Now, before I go any further, there was a question in Microsoft SQL, any reason not to do all this in SQL maintenance plans? You're only going to create these backups right here if you're using Firebird. Now, that was one of the things on the tech data sheet, is that you'll use the server administrator tools for backups only if you're using Firebird, and this is going to back up the database and the files themselves. So you're right, if you are using SQL, if you started with SQL or converted it over to SQL, then yes, you would use the SQL maintenance plans to do your backups of the database, and then you would have to use a separate third-party tool to actually back up the vault files, which would be in the location where you specified that they would be stored when you created that vault. So if we look at this, let's say if this were a SQL database, I would want to back up this folder structure for all of my document files, and then I would want to back up the database itself on the SQL side. So what we're doing right here is only if you were using Firebird. The concept is the same. You would just apply this concept on the SQL Server as a maintenance plan. So what we've got here is the full backup running on Monday. On Tuesday we have a differential. On Wednesday we have a differential. And each of these, I don't think, I didn't change the schedule to make this on Wednesday. So we've got a full on 3.3, a differential on 3.4, a differential on 3.5. This is a different differential. This one is Tuesday, this one is Wednesday. What you would end up with then is when Monday rolls around, it will overwrite this full backup. When Tuesday rolls around, it will overwrite this differential backup. When Wednesday rolls around, it overwrites this differential. And so you will create 7 jobs, 1 full and 6 differential, all overriding the prior. And so you'll have a good rolling backup of full and differential information from the vault. If any one of these fails, you would have a good one to fall back on from the day before or the last full backup. Some people want to run full backups every single day. That's fine too. They're obviously going to take up more space. So that's a personal preference and depending on how much space you have available. But that really takes care of a good cycle. Now, sometimes people may want to do full backups every 2 weeks and differentials in between. Or you might want to keep, let's say, 2, 3, or 4 entire weeks worth of backups. Well, then you would need to create these jobs that many times. So if I do a full backup on Monday and 6 differentials, I could create another full backup and 6 more differentials, name them differently so that they all overwrite correctly, and it might be first Monday, first Tuesday, first Wednesday, second Monday, second Tuesday, second Wednesday. So I'll put in some type of naming convention that will make that work so that they overwrite the proper files at the proper time. Another question says, to clarify, Firebird will do both, whereas other database environments would be 2 processes, one for the database, the other for files. That's correct. So when you back up a Firebird database, you've got, or a Firebird vault, you've got everything from that vault in that single backup file. You restore that vault, you've got the database and the files. If you have a SQL-based vault, you would back up the database and separately back up the files. Then when you restore it, you would restore both of those individually. So essentially, when you're restoring a vault from SQL, you would need to restore the database to the SQL server, restore the files into a location, and then when you restore the vault in here, you would point to both of those locations so it knows what it's looking at. So we do a lot more consulting and talk about different backup strategies as part of the consulting if that comes up. I think you can imagine at this point that we could do all kinds of different configurations on backup strategies and how you want to roll those through a cycle. But the capability is here. It's just a matter of implementing that and making sure that you're getting the files that you want on the schedule that you want. All right, we've come to the end of our time. Believe it or not, we really did go through all of these functions in the administrator that are pertinent to the vault for getting it set up and running. I think you can see pretty quickly that between workflows, permissions, and connecting to external sources, there's still quite a lot of information to cover. But I'm going to encourage you to do the homework assignment and make sure that you register for the advanced course if you have not already. It is next week, so that will be March 4th and 5th next week. Please make sure that you make that and pick up some of these additional topics that will absolutely come into play as you are implementing M-files. So you should be looking in the next day or so for an email from me that's going to give you a link to the training material for this. There will also be a link to a recorded version of it, which is actually this one. This is the, I have recorded all 4 sessions this time, which is the first recording of version 10 that we have. So we'll be making that available. And finally, there's going to be a partner training survey that is linked in there. Please fill out that survey because we really do take that seriously, looking to see it's evaluating me as a trainer, it's evaluating the course overall as to the material presented, the material that you get in the links. You know, is it meeting your needs? What could we have done differently? What did you like about it? So it'll probably take you 3 to 5 minutes to fill out, but anything that you can tell us they're good or bad, we want to know so that we can continue improving the training as we go forward. So I appreciate all of you attending and look forward to talking to you in the future. Thanks a lot.